What if the most famous suicide in history never happened? Modern forensic analysis of ancient sources suggests Cleopatra VII may not have died from an asp bite at all. Plutarch's detailed account, written just 75 years after her death, reveals inconsistencies that have puzzled historians for centuries. Before diving into this historically documented investigation, if you enjoy learning about real historical figures through primary sources and archaeological evidence, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these authentic historical mysteries together based on actual ancient records and forensic analysis. The image of Cleopatra dying from an asp's bite, holding the snake to her breast in a final act of defiant suicide, has captivated imaginations for over 2 millennia. This dramatic scene has been painted by countless artists, dramatized in films, and accepted as historical fact by millions. But when we examine the actual ancient sources, the accounts written by historians who had access to contemporary witnesses, a very different picture emerges. The legendary version of Cleopatra's death serves multiple narrative purposes. It portrays her as a tragic heroine who chose death over dishonor, emphasizes her connection to Egyptian religious symbolism, the asp being associated with pharaonic power, and provides a dramatically satisfying conclusion to one of history's greatest love stories. But none of these narrative conveniences necessarily make the story true. Modern forensic pathologists who have analyzed the ancient accounts point out numerous problems with the asp theory. The timing doesn't work. Asp venom typically takes hours to kill, yet sources suggest Cleopatra died relatively quickly. The symptoms described by ancient writers don't match known effects of asp bites. Most significantly, security around Cleopatra was incredibly tight. How could a deadly snake have been smuggled past Roman guards into her closely monitored quarters? Our most detailed account of Cleopatra's death comes from Plutarch's Life of Antony, written around 105 to 1115 AD, approximately 75 years after the events. This timing is significant. While not contemporary, Plutarch was close enough to the events to potentially interview people who had known Cleopatra personally or had direct access to eyewitness accounts. Plutarch, a Greek historian known for his careful research and balanced approach, provides multiple versions of how Cleopatra might have died, suggesting that even in his time, the exact circumstances were uncertain. He writes, "What really took place is known to no one, since it was also found that she carried poison in a hollow bodkin about which she wound her hair, yet there was not so much as a spot found on her body, nor any symptom of poison." This passage is crucial because Plutarch explicitly states that no physical evidence of poisoning was found on Cleopatra's body. If she had been bitten by an asp, there would have been visible bite marks, swelling, and other physical indicators. The absence of such evidence was noted even by ancient observers. Plutarch then describes the asp theory almost as an afterthought. Some say that an asp was brought to her in the basket with the figs, and that she had ordered it to be buried under the fruit and leaves, so that the creature might fasten itself upon her body without her being aware of it. But when she took away some of the figs and saw it, she said, "So here it is," and baring her arm held it out to be bitten. The tentative language Plutarch uses, some say, indicates that this was already being treated as one possible version among many, rather than established fact. More importantly, he immediately follows this with another possibility. Others say that the asp was kept in a water jar, and that when Cleopatra stirred it up with a golden distaff, it sprang up and fastened itself upon her arm. The fact that Plutarch records multiple contradictory versions of the same event suggests that the true circumstances of Cleopatra's death were already shrouded in uncertainty and possibly deliberate misinformation within decades of her demise. To understand why the circumstances of Cleopatra's death might have been deliberately obscured or mythologized, we must examine the political context and the motivations of those who controlled the narrative, primarily Octavian, later Augustus, and his supporters. Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century AD but drawing on earlier sources, provides additional details that complicate the Aspa narrative. In his Roman history, Dio mentions that Cleopatra had been testing various poisons on condemned prisoners, seeking a painless and quick method of death. This suggests premeditation and scientific approach to suicide that contrasts with the spontaneous snakebite story. Dio writes, she had experimented with all sorts of deadly drugs, using condemned criminals as subjects, and she had observed that the quick-acting poisons made death painful and violent, while the milder ones were slow to take effect. This systematic approach to finding the perfect method of suicide suggests someone who would not leave her death to chance with an unpredictable snake. The Roman sources also reveal significant political motivations for promoting certain versions of Cleopatra's death. For Octavian, having defeated both Antony and Cleopatra, it was important that their deaths be seen as appropriate to their characters and circumstances. Antony's suicide by sword could be portrayed as the honorable death of a Roman general, while Cleopatra's death by asp could emphasize her exotic foreign nature and her connection to Egyptian mysticism. More cynically, the suicide narrative served Octavian's purposes by eliminating any suggestion that he had ordered the execution of Egypt's last pharaoh. Having Cleopatra die by her own hand, whether by snakebite or poison, removed any potential criticism that Rome had murdered a foreign queen who had formally surrendered. Modern medical and forensic analysis reveals numerous problems with the traditional Aspi death narrative that ancient sources either overlooked or deliberately ignored. These scientific inconsistencies provide compelling evidence that the story, while dramatic, is likely false. First, the timing issue is insurmountable. Egyptian cobras, the most likely candidate for the aspi mentioned in ancient sources, inject venom that typically takes 2 to 8 hours to cause death, depending on the victim's size, health, and the amount of venom injected. Ancient sources suggest that Cleopatra was found dead relatively quickly after her final meal, with some accounts implying she died within an hour or two of being discovered. Second, cobra venom causes distinctive symptoms that would have been easily observable and would likely have been recorded by ancient historians if they had occurred. These include severe swelling at the bite site, difficulty breathing, paralysis starting from the bite location and spreading throughout the body, and often violent convulsions. None of these symptoms are described in any ancient account of Cleopatra's death. Third, the logistics of snake smuggling present serious challenges. Cleopatra was under close Roman guard, with her quarters and all food deliveries carefully monitored. The idea that a large, venomous snake could be hidden in a basket of figs and transported past multiple security checkpoints strains credibility. Dr. Andrew Gray, a herpetologist at the Natural History Museum in London, has noted that Egyptian cobras are not typically aggressive toward humans unless directly threatened. Simply uncovering a cobra in a fruit basket would not necessarily provoke an attack, and even if it did, the snake would be more likely to flee than to bite. Furthermore, the supposed method of concealment, hiding a snake under fruit and leaves, would likely kill or severely stress the animal, making it either dead or too weakened to deliver a fatal bite by the time it reached Cleopatra. Recent underwater archaeological excavations in Alexandria's ancient harbor have provided new insights into Cleopatra's final days and the broader context of her death, though they have not definitively solved the mystery of how she died. Dr. Franck Goddio's team, working with the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, has recovered numerous artifacts from what appears to be the royal quarter of ancient Alexandria. These discoveries include coins bearing Cleopatra's image, ceremonial objects that likely belong to the royal household, and architectural elements from buildings that would have been part of her palace complex. More significantly, the excavations have revealed evidence of the hasty evacuation and partial destruction of the royal quarter following Octavian's conquest. This suggests a systematic effort to remove or destroy evidence, which could explain why so few contemporary records of Cleopatra's final days survive. The archaeological evidence also supports ancient descriptions of the luxury and sophistication of Cleopatra's court. Chemical analysis of recovered vessels has revealed traces of various substances, including several that were known to be toxic in the ancient world. While this doesn't prove that Cleopatra used poison, it confirms that such substances were available in her palace. Perhaps most intriguingly, the excavations have uncovered what appears to be a sophisticated laboratory or workshop area within the palace complex. Ancient sources, including Dio's account of Cleopatra testing poisons on condemned prisoners, suggest that she had access to considerable medical and chemical knowledge. The archaeological evidence supports this, revealing equipment and residues consistent with experimental work on various substances. If not an ass bite, then how did Cleopatra actually die? The most forensically plausible explanation, supported by several ancient sources, is that she used a fast-acting poison, possibly concealed in a cosmetic applicator or jewelry. Plutarch mentions that Cleopatra was found to have carried poison in a hollow bodkin, about which she wound her hair. A bodkin was a long, thin implement used for arranging hair or applying cosmetics. Such an object could easily conceal a small amount of concentrated poison and would have been a normal part of a queen's toiletry items, unlikely to arouse suspicion from guards. This method would solve several of the problems with the asp theory. It would allow for rapid death depending on the poison used, would leave minimal physical evidence, and could be implemented without requiring the smuggling of dangerous animals past Roman security. Ancient sources describe several substances that could have served this purpose. Aconitine, derived from monkshood, was known to the ancient world and can cause death within 15 to 30 minutes of ingestion. It causes minimal external symptoms, primarily affecting the cardiovascular and nervous systems. Cyanide compounds, while not known by that name, were available from certain plant sources and could cause rapid death with few external signs. Strabo, the geographer and historian who was contemporary with these events, mentions poison as a possible cause of death, but is vague about the specific method. His account suggests that there was uncertainty, even among those close to the events, about exactly how Cleopatra died. The poison theory also aligns better with what we know of Cleopatra's character and capabilities. She was highly educated, had access to the best physicians and scholars of her time, and according to ancient sources, had been methodically researching methods of suicide. Such a person would be more likely to choose a reliable, tested method rather than depending on the unpredictable behavior of a wild animal. While ancient sources focus on suicide, either by asp or poison, a few modern historians have raised the possibility that Cleopatra was actually murdered on Octavian's orders, with the suicide story created as a cover-up. This theory, while lacking strong evidence, addresses some puzzling aspects of the historical record. Octavian clearly benefited from Cleopatra's death. She represented a continuing threat to his authority, both as a potential rallying point for opponents and as someone with intimate knowledge of Roman political and military secrets gained during her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. The theory suggests that Octavian may have initially intended to keep Cleopatra alive as a prisoner to display in his triumph, but changed his mind when he realized the risks she posed. Having her quietly eliminated while maintaining the fiction of suicide would serve his political purposes while avoiding the negative publicity of executing a surrendered queen. However, this theory faces significant challenges. Ancient sources, including those not particularly friendly to Octavian, consistently describe Cleopatra's death as suicide. Roman political culture, while brutal, generally maintained certain forms and proprieties, especially regarding the treatment of foreign royalty who had formally surrendered. More importantly, if Octavian had ordered Cleopatra's assassination, it would have been difficult to keep such an order secret from all contemporary sources. Roman political gossip was extensive and persistent, and such a scandalous secret would likely have surfaced in at least some ancient accounts. Understanding how Cleopatra died requires examining the circumstances of her final days and her psychological state following the defeat at Actium and Antony's death. After Octavian's victory at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria with the remnants of her fleet. For nearly a year, she attempted to negotiate with Octavian, offering various concessions in exchange for her life and some form of continued rule over Egypt. These negotiations reveal a woman desperately trying to find a way to survive and protect her children's future. Contemporary sources describe Cleopatra during this period as still active and calculating, working on multiple potential escape plans. She considered fleeing to India with a substantial treasure, investigated the possibility of transporting her ships overland to the Red Sea, and even explored potential alliances with Nubian kingdoms to the south. The fact that she was still actively planning for survival so close to her death argues against the idea that she had long planned to commit suicide. Instead, it suggests that her final decision to die may have been made suddenly when she realized that all alternatives had been exhausted. The immediate trigger for her suicide appears to have been Octavian's arrival in Alexandria and her realization that she would indeed be taken to Rome as a prisoner. Ancient sources suggest that she learned she would be paraded in Octavian's triumph, a humiliation that would have been unbearable for someone who had ruled as a goddess queen for over 20 years. This context supports the poison theory over the asp narrative. A woman making a sudden, desperate decision would be more likely to use a proven method she had prepared in advance, rather than attempting to implement an elaborate and uncertain plan involving a dangerous animal. One aspect of Cleopatra's death that is often overlooked in popular accounts is what happened to her children and how her concern for their welfare may have influenced her final decisions. Cleopatra had 4 children: Caesarion, allegedly by Julius Caesar, and 3 children by Mark Antony: Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. Ancient sources make it clear that protecting these children was one of her primary concerns during her final negotiations with Octavian. Historical records indicate that Cleopatra attempted to secure guarantees for her children's safety and future as part of any surrender agreement. The fact that she ultimately chose death rather than captivity may have been influenced by her assessment of what would best serve her children's interests. In the event, her calculations proved partially correct. Caesarion, as the alleged son of Julius Caesar, was seen as too dangerous to Octavian's legitimacy and was executed shortly after his mother's death. However, her 3 children by Antony were spared and raised in Octavian's household, with Cleopatra Selene eventually becoming Queen of Mauritania. This concern for her children's welfare adds another dimension to understanding her death. If she believed that her suicide would remove the primary obstacle to their survival, it would represent not just escape from personal humiliation, but a calculated sacrifice for their benefit. The transformation of Cleopatra's death from historical event to cultural legend illustrates how political propaganda can reshape collective memory and obscure historical truth. Octavian's regime had clear motivations for promoting certain versions of both Antony's and Cleopatra's deaths. The suicide narrative served multiple propaganda purposes. It eliminated any suggestion that Rome had murdered surrendered enemies. It portrayed both deaths as appropriate consequences of their moral failings, and it provided dramatic closure to a story that had captivated the Roman public. The specific details of the Asp death story served additional symbolic purposes. In Egyptian religious tradition, the cobra was associated with pharaonic power and divine protection. Having Cleopatra die from a cobra bite created a poetic irony. She was killed by the very symbol of the power she claimed to embody. For Roman audiences, the exotic nature of death by asp reinforced stereotypes about Egyptian decadence and the foreign, dangerous nature of Eastern rulers. It made Cleopatra's death seem both fitting and alien, appropriate to someone who had represented such a threat to Roman values. Over time, these propaganda elements became embedded in the historical record. Later historians, lacking access to contemporary sources that had been lost or suppressed, relied on accounts that had already been filtered through Roman political interpretation. The process was accelerated by the literary potential of the Asp story. Ancient poets and playwrights found the image of the beautiful queen dying from a snake bite far more dramatically compelling than a mundane death by poison. Each retelling embellished the story further, moving it progressively further from historical reality. Contemporary forensic pathologists and toxicologists who have examined the ancient accounts of Cleopatra's death have reached near consensus that the asp bite story is medically implausible, while death by poison remains entirely possible given the substances and methods available in the ancient world. Dr. Andrew Kaunitz, a forensic pathologist who has studied ancient cases, notes that the ancient descriptions of Cleopatra's body after death are inconsistent with cobra envenomation. Ancient sources describe her as appearing peaceful, as if asleep, with no signs of the swelling, discoloration, and distortion that would be expected from a venomous snake bite. Chemical analysis of cosmetic implements and jewelry from Ptolemaic Egypt has revealed that many contain traces of toxic substances, either deliberately added for their supposed beautifying properties or as a result of the materials used in their construction. This provides a plausible delivery mechanism for poison that would have been both readily available and unlikely to arouse suspicion. Toxicologists have identified several substances known to the ancient world that could produce the rapid, relatively peaceful death described in ancient sources. These include various plant alkaloids that could be concentrated into extremely potent forms using techniques available to ancient Egyptian physicians and chemists. The forensic evidence strongly supports the conclusion that if Cleopatra did indeed commit suicide, she almost certainly used poison rather than allowing herself to be bitten by a snake. The ongoing search for Cleopatra's tomb has implications for understanding the circumstances of her death, though the tomb's location remains one of archaeology's greatest unsolved mysteries. Dr. Kathleen Martinez, who has been excavating at Taposiris Magna, west of Alexandria, believes that Cleopatra and Antony may have been buried together at this site rather than in Alexandria itself. Her team has discovered numerous artifacts consistent with Ptolemaic royal burial practices, including coins bearing Cleopatra's image and evidence of elaborate mummification processes. If Cleopatra's body is eventually discovered, modern forensic techniques could potentially determine her actual cause of death. Advanced chemical analysis might detect traces of poison that would have been invisible to ancient observers, while examination of any preserved soft tissue could reveal evidence of trauma or disease. However, the discovery and examination of Cleopatra's remains would raise significant ethical and practical challenges. Egyptian authorities would need to balance scientific research with cultural and religious sensitivities, and any findings would need to be interpreted carefully to avoid sensationalism. The tomb search has already provided valuable information about Ptolemaic burial practices and the political context of Cleopatra's final days. These discoveries help confirm aspects of ancient accounts while raising new questions about others. The story of Cleopatra's death by asp bite has had profound cultural and historical impact, influencing everything from Renaissance art to modern archaeological research priorities. Understanding how this legend developed and spread provides insights into the relationship between historical truth and cultural narrative. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, which firmly established the asp death in English literature, drew on Plutarch's account but emphasized the most dramatic elements while downplaying the historian's uncertainty about the actual circumstances. This literary treatment became more influential than the historical sources on which it was based. The romanticization of Cleopatra's death contributed to broader misconceptions about ancient Egypt and its relationship with Rome. The exotic, mysterious nature of the asp story reinforced Orientalist stereotypes that continue to influence popular understanding of the ancient world. In academic circles, the persistence of the asp legend has sometimes diverted attention from more important historical questions about Cleopatra's political achievements, administrative capabilities, and the broader context of Ptolemaic Egypt's decline. The evidence strongly suggests that the most famous suicide in history, Cleopatra's death by asp bite, probably never happened. Instead, the last pharaoh of Egypt most likely died by poison, possibly self-administered, using a concealed applicator in a final act of defiance against Roman conquest. This conclusion doesn't diminish Cleopatra's historical significance, but it does remind us how political propaganda and cultural preferences can shape historical memory. The dramatic story of death by snakebite served the narrative needs of multiple audiences: Roman propagandists, ancient poets, and modern entertainers, but it obscured the more complex reality of her final days. Cleopatra VII remains one of history's most fascinating figures, a highly educated ruler who spoke multiple languages, administered a complex kingdom for over 2 decades, and challenged the growing power of Rome itself. Her actual death, whether by poison or other means, represents not romantic tragedy, but political calculation, the final move in a game she had played skillfully for years, but ultimately could not win. The mystery of exactly how she died may never be completely solved, but the forensic and historical evidence points clearly away from the legendary asp and toward a more mundane but no less significant reality. In seeking historical truth over romantic legend, we honor not just the memory of Egypt's last pharaoh, but the importance of evidence-based understanding of the past. Understanding what really happened in that Alexandria palace on August 3030 BC requires us to look beyond the dramatic imagery that has captivated imaginations for 2 millennia and examine the careful records left by ancient historians who were closer to the truth than we might expect. In doing so, we discover that reality, while less dramatic than legend, is often more revealing of the complex political and personal forces that shape historical events. The real Cleopatra, brilliant, calculating, ultimately defeated, but refusing to surrender her dignity, emerges as a more compelling figure than the romantic heroine of popular imagination. Her true story, freed from the distortions of propaganda and myth, provides valuable insights into the end of the Hellenistic world and the beginning of Roman imperial dominance that would shape the next millennium of Mediterranean history.